Hi, Hannah. Welcome to the Open Door Sisterhood podcast.
I'm so glad to be with you, Alex, and with Krista.
We are glad to have you. I have to tell our listeners that I give my full endorsement to Hannah as part of the sisterhood because I am a big Twitter follower and she is full of wisdom. Why don't you tell people just where you are in the world? Because I think that impacts your viewpoint and the kinds of things that you like to talk about the rest of the year before we jump into Christmas.
Yes, and I love that you bring that up because I think where we're situated in the stories that God gives us does affect not just how we view the same thing, but what even catches our attention. So my husband and I live in Southwest Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains. We've lived here about 10 years. He's from the area originally. I grew up in a similar area north up in Southwest Pennsylvania. So we both grew up in kind of rural spaces, working class spaces. And then when we met each other at college, we kind of had this almost this insider language, like we kind of understood the categories each other was talking in. And we really connected, especially around the natural world and living in the spaces we did. So fast forward 20 years, we now live in Southwest Virginia, and we've been involved over the course of our marriage in local church work. He is currently a church administrator. I, along the way, started writing. We've got 3 kids. And so the kinds of things that catch my attention tend to fall in the matrix of vocation, calling, flourishing, within the world as God's created it. So questions about how we live as communities, the kinds of ways we can live out image bearing with each other, and what it means to kind of do this in a larger ecology as created beings and living within the spaces and the places that God has called us to. So if I have to, give my elevator pitch, that's kind of what captures my attention and the direction that a lot of my writing takes.
Yeah. And I'll tell readers, for me, what that means as somebody who follows you is that I get a lot of insight from, I think, a really trusted perspective on the headlines of the day. So if you're wondering, like, what does this particular news story mean for me, or what's a lens that I can consider this through given my Christian faith, or what are questions that as a Christian I should be asking about this particular moment politically, historically, culturally, I feel like those are the kinds of things that you throw out there and you say, these are the questions I'm asking, and these are the kinds of answers that I'm coming up with. And I find them to be so helpful as I make sense, or try to make sense. I don't always make sense. Try to make sense of the world and the news feed that is right alongside your commentary on Twitter.
I love that you have articulated it as questions. What questions should we be asking? Because I feel like a lot of times we're just looking to get to the solution, and sometimes the solutions we come to are flawed because our original questions were flawed. So for me, I just have so much curiosity about the world, even about the problems that we're facing, that I probably spend a little more time on the front end trying to excavate what is the question that I should be asking. And if we get to the solution, or if we get to the answer, that's great too. But if we can frame up our questions well first, I think that gets us much further along in our conversations.
Okay, so let's take that thought and transition it to apply it to Christmas. Mm-hmm. What should we be asking right now as we head into the Christmas? Well, we're in it. As we continue into the Christmas season, and probably a lot of our listeners pushed play because they're a little bit in panic mode. They're like, oh yeah, peace, not happening. Right. Joy, it's not there. What are the big questions that we should be holding in tension with our actual lives as we celebrate Advent?
So I don't know what questions we should be asking, but I know the questions that I ask, and the ones that resurrect for me every year and tend to be the ones that I wanted to find answers to. So the questions I ask at this point of the season is if this is the most wonderful time of the year, why am I so stressed and unhappy? Why am I so overwhelmed by a season that is really supposed to be an invitation into, religious Christian practice, into kind of a more spiritual perspective? What am I missing that my actual lived experience of this moment is at such odds with what it's promising? So that was one of the kinds of questions that was behind even my own entry and exploration of Advent. Some folks may have grown up with Advent as a tradition or practice of their home. For me, growing up, Advent was just the countdown. It was just from December 1 to December 25. And by the time we got to about day 15, we were exhausted from 2 weeks of preparation, but we still had 10 more days to get to the goal. And so in that framework, Christmas became the last big celebration in a cycle of many little celebrations that were supposed to escalate. And quite frankly, maybe it's just my personality, maybe the way I move through the world, I've found that increasingly unsustainable. And I found that I wanted to shift more emphasis and focus toward Christmas, but that the world around me wasn't really helping with that. That all the patterns and rhythms of the season, by the time we were getting to Christmas, we were kind of limping across the finish line. And we were so happy for it to be finally there because we could take down everything and box it up within a few days. And that felt like that's odd that this is my experience. But I also thought it was an experience that a lot of other people were having as well, right? So as I kind of leaned into that, I began to understand more about Advent, about these weeks before Christmas, as historically radically different than the way we celebrate them today. That historically, these weeks would be preparation by refraining from all the busyness to a degree. It would be more preparation by reflecting and waiting, kind of putting our celebrations down the road a little bit. And then in that sense, getting our hearts and our minds ready to receive the gift that's coming on the 25th. So that was a real central tension that I was experiencing both as an individual and as a person in charge of the kind of traditional life of a family. Was my experience of this holiday season wasn't producing, just very pragmatically, it was not producing the kind of spirituality that I wanted to emphasize within our home. So as much as we wanted to keep Christ in Christmas, we all just felt exhausted by it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would love to hear just even practically what you did to make that switch and how your kids responded. Because I mean, I look at, for some kids, that Advent leading up, that Advent calendar that you were referring to, the more secular version even, is something the kids look forward to. So how did you deal with that? And, just give us what that switch looked like.
Yeah, one of the things that we also have to understand about the way we practice holidays is that we receive them. So we're getting traditions given to us and handed to us. So we come up in traditions, and it's both within our families of origin, it's within our religious life, our church traditions, and it's within broader society. And I can remember even from childhood, the traditions around broader society have shifted dramatically. We talk about how early Christmas decorations are in the stores, right? And there's this kind of running grumpy old man kind of conversation about, it's not even Halloween and I already saw Christmas decoration. So there has been a legitimate shift even over the course of my lifetime to pushing Christmas earlier and earlier. But I also realized that part of what was happening in my own family were traditions that I had received. So there were some that I wanted to keep, and I wanted to make sure as I evaluated what to push to the side a little bit more and what to emphasize, we did keep an Advent calendar practice that my husband had grown up with, and my mother-in-law had gifted us a homemade, almost like wall art Advent calendar that had small felt ornaments that we had been using with the kids from the time they were children, just very young, that told the story of redemption. So we go through that for 25 days. And that really did lead us up to Christmas. So we kept that, like we kept a feature of the counting down. But what I chose to kind of invert or to push away was to not feel the obligation to decorate as soon as everyone else was, to not feel the obligation to keep up with this kind of running timeline that was happening around me. So I didn't want the marketplace telling me when to start my Christmas celebration. I didn't want Black Friday to be my first day of Christmas. And so my kids kind of just learned either by default or just knowing that that's what life was going to be like with mom, that our house, our family doesn't start our Christmas kind of celebrations at the same time that their friends would. And so it wasn't this resistance of like negativity. It wasn't a critique of anyone else, what they were doing, but it was a non-anxious presence. It was saying things like, well, in our family, we're going to put up our tree halfway through December. And part of that was because we get a live Christmas tree. And if we get it too early, then by Christmas Day, it's going to look terrible. So we're just going to wait. And so typically we will only have our Christmas tree up maybe mid-December, and then we'll keep it up a little bit longer. We'll try to hold it out until maybe the first week of January, if we can make it, depending on what condition it's in. So it was just a kind of non-anxious sense of, in our family, this is when we choose to do this, and not feeling obligation to anybody else's timeline. And then eventually, as we discovered more about the history of Advent, as it was kind of a pull this out, put this in, don't feel this obligation to the pressure of the season, but also bring in more opportunity for reflection, for, maybe readings or kind of conversation or an attention and an attunement to this season of waiting and hoping for what's coming at Christmas time.
How old are your kids?
Well, they are old now, which is so fascinating because you start with little ones and then in a matter of time, they get old again. So I have an 18-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 13-year-old. So our traditions are pretty well established at this point with them, and they have a sense of what they want to see, happen. And over the years, there are things that we've determined were important enough to hold on to and to carry forward. But we also tried to have enough flexibility around that they didn't, feel like these things were set in stone. There was kind of a margin of flexibility.
So that you're in charge of the traditions aren't in charge of you. Exactly.
Thank you. That's exactly right. They serve what we're attempting to accomplish within our family's discipleship life, not the other way around.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of families who maybe their teenagers wouldn't be so open to having a reflective time every day during Advent, and how you navigate that, because ultimately we're only in control of us, especially as our kids get older. And so I guess what would that look like for someone to even hold that in their own heart, even if their family is not wanting to participate?
Right. So one of the things I think I want to clarify is teenagers are not generally reflective or participatory in any way, at least in my experience. And so we don't have this idealistic kind of gathering around the family. But what I have realized is that wherever my heart is, wherever my mind is, and wherever the parents are, is going to naturally overflow into the kinds of conversations that I have with my kids, into what is important to what I voice. And so one of the things I think that's really significant about parenting is we often opt for, give me the 3 steps that I can, pass this along to my kid. And I think the first step is it has to be yours. Like if we gave more attention to our own attunement, our own kind of focus. That's where it starts. I realized when my daughter was very young, I had this kind of moment of almost painful awareness that we become our parents, right? We become our mothers, whether we choose to or not. In some way, we will model what is in front of us. And so I realized that whoever I wanted my daughter to become, I had to become first. That my walk and my attunement was very important. So for me, that means making sure I am focusing on what needs to be focused on. And then I think the other thing that's really important for families is to remember the power of the rhythm and the cycle, not the really serious or significant conversation. So we tend to think, if I just have this one really, really important contemplative spiritual experience with my child, that's the thing that's going to change them. When in reality, the things that are shaping us often are just the repetition. It's just growing up in a family that every year has holidays. That every year names what's happening with God coming to earth as a baby. It's a family that pulls up the Advent calendar and schleps their way through it the best they can that year. And so I want us to also really be aware that it is the rhythm and the cycle that's doing a ton of work, not just this perfectly crafted encounter with our child. So if the only thing you can do one year is to maintain some of the cycles and the rhythms, that's actually going to pay dividends down the road.
Okay, your book is titled Heaven and Nature Sing, and you talk a lot about the natural world and how the natural world helps you experience God during Advent. So can you talk to us about that? And it seems like how it impacts us naturally would also impact our children if we're taking them outside and noticing how God is continuing to move in the natural world.
So this idea of paying attention to the witness of creation is really coming forward in my writing a little bit more in my last few books. I wasn't really sure it was happening until it was happening. And then I was like, oh, okay, I need to pay attention to that. And my last book was a set of essays on the seasonal cycles, like through the 4 seasons that we experience here in Virginia. And what I'm hoping to kind of draw people's attention to is not nature as a hobby. Okay. It's not nature as I love to be out gardening, or I love to be out hiking, or I love to just be out in the created world. Like, that's great. If that's your inclination and that's what you love, by all means, go do it. But what I hope to call people's attention to is, regardless of whether we really enjoy that kind of thing, there is a testimony of creation that's happening around us that we desperately need in this moment in time. So our lives are increasingly detached from natural rhythms, natural cycles. Even if you think about the way electricity has changed our perception of light and darkness, how there are cycles of the sun rising and the sun setting, but we would never know it because we go inside and we turn on the light, or we sit in front of our screens. And so we live in a moment where, as human beings, we're deeply detached from the kind of created cycles that I think God has intended us to live in. And all of this kind of, and again, I'm not this like Luddite, let's go back to pre-modern life, but I do think there's a testimony and witness that we're missing because we've become so detached. It's things about disembodiment. It's about the fact that we aren't even in tune with our own bodies as created beings. We're not in tune with what God's doing in the witness of creation. We're not aware of these kinds of cycles. And when we think about something even like Advent, we're talking about a cycle. We're talking about a rhythm that happens every year, that as the years pass, we would learn. We would learn it a little more and a little more and a little more each time we do it. And that's exactly what happens in the created world. The year goes through cycles, the day goes through cycles, the earth is turning. And so God is really working in these kind of repetition of truth. And so for me, I'm hoping to invite readers into just more attunement and attention to what God is doing in creation as an access point to what he's doing through his son.
So what might that look like? I mean, in practice, like as a
Right.
concept, that's great, but like in practice, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing it meant for me was accepting myself as a created being who had limits, right? So if we come back to Advent, part of what we're preparing our hearts to receive is that Jesus was incarnated in human flesh, as Philippians 2 puts it, that he left heaven's glories and he came to earth and he took on humanity. And part of what he took on was the limits of humanity, was the humility of not being able to be everywhere in one place, not being able to just keep going and powering through, needing rest, needing cycles of Sabbath, needing, cycles of eating, right? So for me, coming into attunement of the witness of creation includes accepting that I am part of creation with limits. And so in Advent, one of the things that becomes a very immediate kind of implication is when you do get to the place where you're feeling overwhelmed, when you're like, why is this not working? A lot of times that's because we have been pushing past natural human limits. We've been trying to do more in this season than we've been doing any other time of the year. And what's ironic about that is that this season is designed to celebrate the incarnation. It's designed to celebrate God coming into our limits, the transcendent God coming in to save us in all the ways that we can't save ourselves. So for me, that's an invitation to sit with and accept and receive all the things that I can't get done this season, even though I'm being pushed and I'm being told that I really need to push through and accomplish all these things. So for me, it's a really palatable kind of invitation to grace and an invitation to humbly live within the boundaries of my human limits.
It's interesting when you said we're being told. I actually think we just tell ourselves, like, I'm not sure there's, people actually, even if we're looking at media or whatever, ultimately it's our own voices that we're listening to. And so how do you even combat maybe your own voices that are telling you that? Because I think ultimately that's really what it is.
Yeah, it's a set of messages that we internalize and then we amplify, right? So it may be, to your point, that no one else is standing around saying push past human limits, right? But we are kind of looking on Instagram and we're seeing all these beautiful picture perfect families, and we're starting to feel like less than, or we're starting to feel the judgment of, well, my house doesn't look like that, my kids don't look like that, I don't look like that. And then the inner monologue really does become, well, you should. And if you just tried a little harder, and if you just got up a little earlier, and if you blah, 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 then you would be able to look like this. So you're absolutely right that there is a conflict in our own minds in terms of which messages are we going to allow space and which messages are we going to amplify. And so what's beautiful about the incarnation, particularly in this season, is that the message that Christ himself is sending us is there's no shame in your humanity. There's no shame in your limits, because those are limits that I took on, the limits of time and space and not being able to accomplish in 24 hours more than what a human being can, are limits that Jesus Christ himself sanctified. And so when we're in that place and we hear those voices saying, well, you should be able to do this, and the fact that you can't, that's your fault. Really, there's a silencing there that we have to choose who we're listening to. And, the invitation of creatureliness or embracing human limits is an invitation to dependency, ultimately. And I think that's why it's also so beautiful that Jesus comes as a child. It's not that Jesus came only in human flesh, but he came as a child at Christmas time, which means he came fully and completely dependent on the adults around him to care for him. And we're invited into the kingdom of God. We're invited to life with God in the same way, independence. And so for me, that essential conflict is one of, am I going to live in dependence? Am I going to live in dependence on God and on other people? Or am I going to try to push through this in self-reliance and tell myself that if I just work hard enough, if I just get up early enough, if I just push through, then everything will be okay. And really what we're being invited into through the life of Christ is a life of dependence on the Father, in humility and in embrace of all those ways that we need him.
I was thinking too, as you were talking, sometimes it's just a matter of us naming what we need to other people around us, right?
Yeah.
That we're backpacking everything because that's what we do, is we're the Christmas creators. So let's backpack all that. But sometimes, and this has been a season for me of learning more how to do that. I had surgery this year and I've had to do that because I literally have one speed right now. And so, sometimes it's just even a matter of us identifying, okay, what are the things that are important to me? Because maybe, doing the Christmas cookies, that is important, or having the gingerbread competition, like that is important to my kids. So how can we share the load a little bit and say, can you go get gingerbread houses? Yeah. Can you be in charge of this? And so then we're not just carrying everything ourselves.
Right. Absolutely. And that's the other thing that I have learned from observing God's design of creation is that there is no one creature that's living in isolation of the rest of the ecology or the environment that God has placed it in. And there is within nature a God-ordained interdependence that all of these beings, whether it's plants and whether it's flowers and bees, they have this symbiotic kind of interdependence. And yet as human beings, we're so ready to operate in isolation and to try to achieve kind of like this divine transcendence that only God has. But that creation invites us into that kind of mutual dependence on other people within our ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, it gets back to original sin, right?
Mhm.
We just want to do it all by ourselves. Okay, I'm going to read just a little bit from a section in your book that I think is a great example of how you take a natural observation as far as the natural world, and you then see what does this say about God's greater story that I can be considering as I move through Advent. And you talk about how snow seems to be quieter. It seems to be quieter when you're walking outside and it's snowing outside. And you say, my brain is not playing tricks on me, but the truth is less surprising than if it were. Scientifically speaking, it is quieter after a fresh snowfall. A snowflake's six-sided crystalline structure creates small spaces, open pockets, you could say, that absorb sound waves. Because of this unique shape, snow dampens noise much the same way foam panels in a recording studio do. And the more accumulation you have, the greater the effect. In fact, some studies show up to a 60% reduction in sound with just a few inches, at least at first. And then you talk about how there was a silent period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So that kind of ties in God's larger story. But as I'm reading this, I'm thinking of the practical for the woman who might be reading it, and those small pockets that might be created in a snowflake that help dampen the noise. I wonder if that's kind of an analogy for small pockets of time that we can set aside that helps dampen the noise of the outside world so that we can distinguish which voice we're going to listen to, which message we're going to listen to. And so I think that's just a beautiful example of how your book takes an observation from the natural world, ties it to God's macro story, and then we can figure out how we apply it to our own micro story. How would you say you understand silence right now if somebody is sitting in that and saying, God, I want to hear you. I am feeling like I need your voice during this Advent season. And I am trying to slow down enough to actually hear you, because I think part of it is just the busy. We don't slow down enough. But for some of us, we're sitting and we're listening and God's not speaking. How do we understand that this year during Advent?
I really appreciate that question. Back to, what we said at the beginning about framing our questions correctly, because I was raised in a tradition, and I think maybe some other folks were too, that if you just created the right environment, you would hear God's voice. So you could set up something that would make it possible for you to receive a word from God, whether that was setting aside devotional time or confessing your sins or doing all of these practices that are inherently healthy spiritual practices, yet we're not guaranteed that they deliver the voice of God to us, because sometimes there is silence. And our family went through a season of silence, what felt like silence several years ago. And I remember praying during that season for patience. So I felt this awareness that there weren't going to be fast, quick, easy solutions or answers to the things that were happening in our lives. I didn't even feel a deep closeness to God or a sense of his active presence. And so instead, when I would pray, I would just say, please let me stay in this moment and not try to escape it. And so my prayer became, I don't want to exit a space that's really uncomfortable before it's time for me to exit it. And so that kind of resiliency or endurance of waiting is also part of what's happening in Advent, because the waiting, not just for Christ to come, but the waiting for him to return and to set things right. And so what we're really trying to develop in these seasons of silence is the endurance and the perseverance to wait and hope when God isn't speaking, or when we're not sure when the answer is going to come. And that's not something I understood or was raised to really understand is essential to the walk of faith. That the life of faith is a life of hope and trust, even in the silence. And it's something that's cultivated in us. And so for me, my prayer became, please don't let me jump out of this before you begin to speak again.
Yeah, because what you say next in the book is that the pattern, the natural pattern of melting and then refreezing creates sometimes a layer of ice, and then noise is actually amplified. So I thought that was really interesting. The very things that make us sit in silence may also, if we sit long enough, may also
harden us.
that, right. Well, or they help us hear God's voice. Like they create a place where we can, where his voice is amplified in a sense. I find that to be encouraging, that the thing that might, maybe it's a tender place or a hard situation or a circumstance, but we have to sit in it and we have to let the process, that melting and refreezing process happen in order for his voice to be amplified. And that's where that patience comes in.
I think about, the ancients calling it the dark night of the soul too, that space where you're just in a dark night for a long time and you don't hear God, and it seems lonely and desolate and hard. But that's almost, when I've heard people talk about that, and I've experienced it, it's necessary actually to the journey of faith. It's not just something that we think, oh, well, that person had that, but I'm never going to have that. Like, it's actually something we have to go through as we learn about the journey of faith.
And to bring this kind of metaphor with snow full circle, Snow happens in the wintertime when there's no life, right? So when you have 4 seasons, one of those seasons is a season of dormancy. And I think we have so equated growth and harvest and kind of productivity with our spiritual life that we don't understand that seasons of dormancy are essential to our spiritual life as well. That the quiet kind of peace or silence, however you experience, of a season of winter feels very long, but there are things happening in that season that are preparing for spring to come. And if we can become more welcoming, embracing of these seasons, even though they're going to be long and they're going to be dark. That's one of the things about winter too. The light changes. Part of the reason it's cold is because we actually have less light. And so those can be very, very hard seasons. But again, I think it's times to wait in patience and to have the confidence that God will work again, just in his timeline.
Yeah, that's helpful. As we close today, Hannah, is there just a final word of encouragement as people are just smack in the middle of December and just feeling the heat of things?
Yeah. I would just say that what we're feeling is exactly why we're celebrating Christ coming to us, right? So there's no need to push those feelings aside. There's no need to, try to manufacture some kind of joy or self-reliance. And instead, those things drive us to say, yep, this is exactly why we are so excited that the Creator came to his creation, that the Savior came to us, because that is the grace. That is how much we need divine intervention, right? We are waiting on God to step into our lives. And so welcome that. And maybe that may be the thing that prepares you to really receive the gift of December 25th.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Merry Christmas, Hannah.
Merry Christmas to you both too.
Bye.
Bye.